What's up, everybody? Welcome back to class. Okay, so this is going to be the third and final installment for the 1960s civil rights protest lecture note series that I've done. If you haven't checked out parts 1 and 2, I'd recommend you go see those first. Although for this particular lecture note series, it honestly wouldn't really matter what order you view them in. Per se, you're going to get kind of the same information. However, it's probably ideal to view them and go through in a chronological fashion, because that's how I kind of covered them. And the one that we're hitting today, which this would definitely go into, I know I've told you to have 2 pages of notes going, Cold War notes and then civil rights notes, where we're covering the same time period in history, but the civil rights is looking at internal domestic policy in America, Cold War is like foreign policy. This stuff obviously is going to go into your civil rights or like your domestic policy notes. So today I would put a big heading for Selma. The last chunk that I gave you was about the peaceful marches that were done in Birmingham, Alabama, which was often called the most racist city in America. This is another city in Alabama. So we keep going back to Alabama, right? But typically, Alabama and Mississippi kind of get the reputation as being the most southern of southern states. Now, parts of Texas and Florida actually go further south, but metaphorically speaking, these were the states, Alabama, Mississippi, probably that were the most rigidly segregationist. So anyway, that's where Martin Luther King and a lot of protesters, where they'll focus their effort. And that might seem kind of weird and counterproductive, but think about it. The whole reason for going into Birmingham, Alabama was they knew there was a very kind of cranky old sheriff who was super racist and very pro-segregation. And even though his protests are going to be peaceful, they were hoping to provoke action by the police and get that covered in the media to win over sympathy, to win over a lot of white Americans in other parts of the country to their cause and get legislative action taking place. Now, in 1963, that's when the Birmingham protests happened. And that's when that year later on is when Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech at the Washington Mall, right in front of the Lincoln Memorial. All right. The next year in 1964 is when the 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed into law through Congress. I haven't really talked about that yet, but there's 2 pieces of legislation that I really want you to know about, and I should have probably already included that on the notes, but that's something for anybody that is watching right now. That is definitely going to be a quiz question at some point, and it'll be covered on the semester exam. So I would put that in after where we left off last time with Birmingham, Alabama, put in the Civil Rights Act 1964. And it basically, that law, to give a kind of a common sense, quick definition of it or something, or explanation, but that law essentially bans segregation. It says you can't have a segregated society anymore. So a really big piece of legislation says you can't discriminate against people based on their race. Now, voting is kind of in some ways a separate issue. You would think the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would have taken care of the voting problem, but that still really lingered. And what do I mean by that? A lot of those southern states, remember, even when the Supreme Court or Congress would take action to the federal government and say, you can't have segregated schools or segregated busing anymore, a lot of those southern governors and local southern mayors and sheriffs were very slow to react. One of the things that was a big holdup for getting some changes and making progress was a lot of the Jim Crow laws focused on voter discrimination. Essentially, they would have Jim Crow laws, and it would look different in every southern state, in every county. These might be slightly different, but essentially there were a lot of laws that had 2 separate standards for voting. One, for white people, that would be pretty easy, a kind of low bar to come in and vote, and then a much higher bar that was set for black people. And that was really kind of hindering progress. And Martin Luther King basically made the claim that, we can't get a lot of sweeping changes down south, and even in a lot of cities that might even be majority black, until black people really are enfranchised and allowed to vote equally with everybody else in society. So anyway, the Selma protests are going to focus all around like voting rights. The other big chunk of legislation, or the big law that gets passed in the civil rights movement, I would definitely want you to know happens a year after the Civil Rights Act, and it's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Basically, that's going to say you cannot discriminate or have different standards for black people and white people. You have to have a fair and consistent standard that is fairly easy for people to access, the polls and to go in and vote. So Selma is another city in Alabama. They had some very backwards kind of Jim Crow style laws that essentially what they had there, this specific Jim Crow law in Selma, Alabama, was it was a literacy test. So, like, if you were a white person in Selma, Alabama, and you wanted to come in and vote, they would have you read something. I don't know exactly what, but it'd be something very, very simple. You're reading a book like See Spot Run, just proving you can read basic kind of, you know what I mean, at a, I don't know, second grade reading level. If a black person came in, they would give them a literacy test too, and they would have to like read and recite like the preamble to the Constitution or something like that. They're going to give them something way, way tougher. And even if you could do it correctly, a lot of times they would say, whoever the county clerk was, or the person that you're talking to, not good enough. You got to go home, keep practicing. So it's kind of nonsense. It's BS. And they were basically just making it so that black people can't come in and vote. Clear cut, that's racism, it's segregation, it shouldn't be allowed after the Civil Rights Act had passed the year before, but it still was happening. So Martin Luther King this is kind of the last of the really big civil rights protests. And a lot of times I'll hear historians say that the Selma protest is kind of like the high watermark of the civil rights movement. After this, that it really does lead, those two laws, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, do lead to a lot of changes down south, and make it so that black people can go in and vote. And it kind of, the legalized like Jim Crow or segregation is kind of thrown out and done for in the South. Now, that doesn't mean blacks are totally treated equal everywhere, but under the law, you know what I mean? Within the system, they should be. So there's still going to be little problems that are happening, but legislatively, they've really kind of gotten rid of the whole separate but equal mindset and the segregation and the Jim Crow laws of the South. Now, Martin Luther King is going to go on and do protests for the next few years, but after Selma, he starts to focus more on the Vietnam War, which we haven't covered yet, but we're going to be coming into that really soon in the near future. So he targets Selma because of its really backwards like literacy tests, which I think I'm going to throw up a political cartoon that I want to share with you that kind of ties into that today. Now, that city also has a pretty racist sheriff. Also, the governor of the state of Alabama is one of the most notorious and kind of backwards Southern governors who is very pro segregation. So again, they target this town because it was kind of like Birmingham, where they weren't getting a lot of sympathy or support from the white population in that town. Now, if this had not been covered by news reporters, if they hadn't had cameras in there, it would have probably been an isolated protest, and I don't know that it would have made a big impact and led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, because actually there wasn't a lot of support in Congress for passing a law like this. A lot of congressmen were saying, we are, oh yeah, black people should be treated equally, but we just passed a law last year that says segregation is done and we're going to integrate and blacks will be treated equally. Why do we need another piece of legislation? So going in and doing this protest, and Martin Luther King specifically, like inviting reporters, and he invited a lot of whites to come. If you look at the photo right up here, it's kind of hard to tell in the background, but there are white people in there that are marching in Selma with Black protesters that Martin Luther King is leading. Anyway, there's kind of a series of marches. The first march that is done, and this is like, covered under the First Amendment, the right to peacefully assemble and just go out and peacefully march with your signs and say we should get equal voting rights, was totally shut down by the sheriff. And the first protest was not like, it wasn't that massive. I think there were thousands of people there, but the final march is going to be much, much bigger. And I'm going to show a couple scenes out of the movie Selma to help kind of illustrate this point. Anyway, as they're like going into the town of Selma to march, or maybe it was they were going out. Wait, that's not super important. They had to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, so a bridge right outside of the town of Selma. Anyway, the protesters, as they're just going and peacefully marching across, they're not rioting or looting or burning, nothing like that. They're met by state troopers and like the sheriff at the bridge, and he tells them, you have to disperse, turn around, get out of here. And the protesters up front, which they actually purposely kept Martin Luther King out of there because they didn't want him to get beaten up or killed or arrested. They wanted him to still be able to kind of keep organizing because they realized they were probably going to have to do this multiple different days. And like in Birmingham, he gets arrested right at the beginning and is in jail through most of the Birmingham protests. Well, they didn't want that to happen again. So Martin Luther King actually wasn't there the day that everything goes violent and kind of goes horribly wrong. There were other guys, kind of his like lieutenants, or guys that were like his right hand men that were out there leading the march and in the front row. And they basically say, hey, we're not going to do that. We're not going to break up and disperse. We're not doing anything unlawful. We're just going and we're doing our march. Well, it all just kind of boils over, and the police come through with bullwhips. They're riding horses. They gas the crowd, like pepper spray them and tear gas them. They're literally like bullwhipping people. Several people get injured horribly bad. And then in the aftermath of it, I think a few people actually ended up getting killed and died in this whole protest. Anyway, there were kind of fortunately, Martin Luther King had, thought ahead, and it's all about optics and like getting this story out and having America at large see it. And there were news cameras there that recorded all this. So I'm going to try my best to find some of the actual live footage of it. But it's recreated really good in the movie Selma. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I highly recommend watching the film that came out about 5 years ago called Selma. It's very well done. It focuses on Martin Luther King and how he kind of put this together, but you'll actually even see Malcolm X come in, and he in an interesting way comes in and tries to bury the hatchet with Martin Luther King because they had not liked each other for most of their careers and had been very adversarial. Well, this is like, nobody would know this at the time, but it's 2 weeks before Malcolm X gets assassinated. And right, it was kind of, I think, a cool thing and kind of interesting that before that happened, he actually right there at the end of his life came in and tried to like mend fences and get on the same page with Martin Luther King. And he actually offered assistance at Selma and said, you know what, I've said some things in the past that, I kind of regret, and I think you're a good guy doing the best of it. And they started kind of working together right there when this whole protest is playing out. Anyway, it does get caught on camera that, all this horrific stuff that's happening to these pretty peaceful protesters. The police definitely look like the bullies again, just like it had been the case in Birmingham, Alabama, where people are getting beat up and for just peacefully marching. And anyway, that doesn't play well in the northern states or the western states. And actually, when they do another march a few days later, they put out the call that's, we don't care where you're at. If you're willing to peacefully march with us, whether you're black or white, no matter what state you're in, come down and stand with the people of Selma. We're trying to push for equal voting rights. And actually, there is a flood of people. People come from Michigan and New York and California and all around the country. And there's actually a lot of white protesters, too, that show up to support Martin Luther King in the protests he's running at Selma. And another massive march happens where there's cameras all over. And then that final march is pretty peaceful, where they march from Selma to the capital of Alabama, and it gets a ton of national news coverage. And that kind of puts pressure on Congress and President Lyndon Johnson, who is the guy that replaces Kennedy after he's assassinated. Because I know we haven't covered the Kennedy assassination quite yet, or maybe I have, depending on when I'm dropping this chunk of notes. But this would be all a little over a year after that had all played out. Anyway, that puts pressure on the government, and then the Civil Rights Act, largely due to the Selma protests and all the events that happened there. Leads to the final big chunk of legislation for the civil rights movement, which is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that basically says that you cannot discriminate for voting based on color, sex, gender, ethnicity. That it has to be a consistent, even bar, that like all adults are allowed to vote. And it also bans like literacy tests and such, that says you don't have to pay a poll tax or pass a test to be able to vote. If you're an adult citizen, you have the right to vote, and that's end of story. That's like an absolute right. Now, just kind of a final follow-up here. The 1960s are a crazy decade, very tumultuous, and lots of assassinations play out through this decade. These, I might come back and talk about some of them at later dates, and I will cover some of these on. I've already talked about a few of them, but we might cover some of these a little more in depth down the road. But some of the most notable ones, and this is not like the list of like there was only 5 assassinations. These are just probably 5 of the most notable ones that I wanted to include for you. Medgar Evers, he was kind of not as well known as Martin Luther King or maybe Malcolm X. Actually, I would say probably when you go back to the early 60s, he's probably more well known than Malcolm X, especially down south. He is kind of like a Martin Luther King, a peaceful protest civil rights leader, but was working out of the state of Mississippi. There's a movie that if we have time called The Ghosts of Mississippi that I want to tie in to class and show you. I think it's a really awesome one because it goes over, there was a trial. They basically caught the guy that had shot Medgar Evers in through the back in his own driveway when he was coming home at night. They caught the guy that did it. He was a racist, white, kind of rabid Southern Klansman. He gets tried twice, and both times there's a hung jury. So he doesn't get acquitted. He doesn't get convicted. It's a hung jury, so it just gets kind of pushed off. But in that case, it's kind of like you weren't convicted, so you don't go to jail. Anyway, they end up trying him again almost 30 years later. And get a conviction on this guy. So kind of an interesting story there. Then JFK, President of the United States, who had been kind of a champion and really spoke positive about the civil rights movement, he gets assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X, right after the Selma protests in 1965, he gets assassinated by other black Muslims from the Nation of Islam that were kind of jealous and upset that he had split away and started his own separate mosque. Then Martin Luther King, about 3 years after the Selma protests, when the Vietnam War is really heating up, he gets assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that down the road and how that just impacted the country. And then riots take place, and it's kind of a weird, ironic, like twist of fate. He was a guy that had been all about peaceful protest, no matter what, nonviolence, don't get violent, don't burn, don't rob, don't loot. Remember civil disobedience. And then weird twist of fate, after he is assassinated, violent protests and riots sweep the country. It happens in Detroit, LA, all the big cities around the country. Probably the worst series of riots, looting, and violent protests the country's ever seen, I think, in 1968 and 69 in the wake of his assassination. And then just months after Martin Luther King gets assassinated, Bobby Kennedy, who is John F. Kennedy's younger brother, he ends up getting assassinated while he's running for president. Now, that usually kind of marks the end of the civil rights movement. Bobby Kennedy was, and we haven't talked much about him yet, he would have been, I think, even far more so than John Kennedy, his older brother. He would have pushed civil rights reforms in a big way, ending the Vietnam War and and moving ahead and doing more for the civil rights movement and equality for blacks were kind of like the two staples of his campaign. He was very, very popular. Who knows if he would have won the general election or not, but he was well on track. He had just won the state of California, and it was like hours after that had been called that he's coming off a stage where he was giving a speech, and a literally like insane guy named Sirhan comes up and shoots him in the belly with a revolver, and he bleeds out at the hospital a few hours later. So very tragic end for actually three of the Kennedy brothers, because remember the oldest one died in a secret mission when his plane exploded in World War II. So that's why a lot of people say like the Kennedy family has a curse, because many members of their family died untimely deaths. But that kind of, when Kennedy and Martin Luther King both get assassinated a few months apart, that kind of takes the steam out of the civil rights movement. A lot of big changes had happened over the previous decade, and then things just kind of simmer and chill out for a while on the civil rights front. But they had accomplished quite a bit, and chiefly the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65. Those two laws did a lot to get rid of segregation and kind of get rid of Jim Crow laws in the South. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. If you have any questions, by all means, hit me up. Oh, and then there is the picture. Sorry, my face was blocking it. The guy up top here was Medgar Evers. Okay, the first guy I have on the list. We might come back and talk to him about him a little bit more down the road, especially if we watch the movie Ghosts of Mississippi. And then here was a photo taken of Robert Kennedy right after he was shot, while he's on the ground, and his aides are surrounding him, and they're trying to get him to the hospital. Okay, if you have any other questions or anything, hit me up. Happy to chat with you more about it and clarify any of these points if you need.